Growing up, my grandfather was always my greatest hero. He was a larger-than-life figure and still is today, even at 94, with that particular kind of charisma that feels like it can bend the universe to his will. And in many ways, he seemed to be successful at just that. Born in the early 1930s to a poor Black and Cherokee single mother in Omaha, Nebraska, he nonetheless was given a deep faith and ambition instilled in him by his mother that fueled him to overcome those marginalized conditions. A scrawny kid growing up, he was bullied by many of his peers until he decided enough was enough and bulked up into a championship wrestler and Eagle Scout who put those bullies in their place. As a star athlete, his grades started to slip until at 16 he had an epiphany that not only would he become a doctor, but that he would graduate from Harvard Med School to do so. And against all odds, he managed that. By time he turned 30, he had not only graduated from Harvard with an MD in honors, he had been made an officer in the Air Force and had married the love of his life and had 3 healthy, happy children. He would go on to open and operate multiple successful private practices, to be awarded professorships and honorary degrees, and to meet his own heroes from the Dalai Lama to Miles Davis. But the ultimate mark of success for him was real estate ownership. Because as a child of the Depression and somebody who grew up knowing that people who looked like him were largely excluded from that measure of control, he realized how instrumental that was to having a say in the course of your own life. And so everything he earned, he invested in real estate. But because his pockets weren't deep enough, he didn't have family money or connections to fall back on, he was outmaneuvered by his competition and ended up losing almost everything. But what else was he to do from that background? Isn't that kind of investment the bedrock of the American dream? But what if we didn't think of housing as an investment? At least not in that sense. What if instead of prioritizing the ability of some to extract as much profit as possible from this necessity of survival, shelter, we instead did everything in our power to ensure that each and every one of us had access to a safe, stable place to call home? How much human potential do we as communities and as a society lose out on because people are struggling to survive under a predatory housing market instead of living to their full? On a single night in January 2024, according to HUD, over 771,000 people were unhoused in the wealthiest country that has ever existed. At the same time, there were nearly 15 million units of vacant housing in the United States. Now, that contrast doesn't make a lot of sense on the surface, but I'm sure we can all think of examples of that phenomenon that we've seen locally in our own lives. I remember being in 5th grade in the early months of 2010 during the ongoing Great Recession and having to move on rather short notice with my mom and my sister because the place that we'd been renting for years simply became too affordable or too expensive for us to afford. We were luckily able to find somewhere relatively nearby, and I remember looking out the window on the drives that my mom did with us in the back seat, exhausting herself to get all our stuff from our old home to our new one while raising 2 kids and working 2 jobs. When I looked out the window, I would see this massive condo development, the first of its kind in my small upstate New York town, that had begun construction in 2007 and now sat vacant despite looking nearly complete. And that didn't make a lot of sense to me as a kid who was seeing on the news all this stuff about people losing their homes. But as I got a little older, I came to understand that the developer who had been building that project realized in the face of the subprime mortgage crash that demand for luxury condo ownership had dropped to about 0. And so it wasn't in his financial interest to continue the project at the time. Zooming out, the current structure of our housing market has incentivized a status quo in which Millions of units sit vacant while hundreds of thousands of people go without a roof overhead, and tens of millions more struggle on that knife's edge of housing insecurity, having to make impossible choices between paying rent and paying for health care, or food, or gas, or a phone bill, or the myriad other costs necessary to survive and to stay a participant in the modern economy. Now, that is a tough dynamic, and it's indicative of the fact that, in short, this housing crisis is the consequence of our utter commodification of this necessity of survival, our turning homes, shelter, into a financialized asset for profit. That, in turn, motivates well-capitalized investors and corporations to buy up as much housing as possible, since there will always be inelastic demand for this life-sustaining good. It also creates a split incentive structure between tenants seeking a safe and stable place to call home at an affordable price and investors who are looking to maximize their return on investment by increasing the cost associated with its use, rent, while cutting the costs that they incur for its ongoing operation, maintenance, capital improvements, the things that keep our homes livable. That is compounded by the fact that in this market, in reality, the price of housing is not set at the intersection of supply and demand. We have housing supply, and while we can and should build more high-quality, affordable housing, we will never build our way out of this crisis if we fail to address the underlying imbalance of social power at play in the rental housing market. Because under our current status quo, large-scale property owners who have a sufficient market share in a given region can effectively set the price of rent in that region unilaterally, and moreover, can ensure that the housing stock there stays, for all intents and purposes, artificially scarce so as to maximize the value of the stock that they currently own. This is in contrast to tenants who are, as a result of that power, forced in many cases to choose between either paying more and more for less and less, or taking their chances in a broader market that's been increasingly gobbled up by these kinds of predatory players, or if they can't do either of those, then staying and facing the possibility of being forced out of their home by the sheriff. Now that sounds pretty bleak, doesn't it? And I don't mean to fearmonger, but the knowledge that fueled my grandfather's ambitions, the knowledge that you lack some fundamental control over the course of your life if you lack control over your housing, is a truth that many of us can feel because we live that lack of control every day. So what do we do about it? Well, like I mentioned, the market is driven first and foremost by the social power of its players. And while large-scale landlords have significant power, tenants do too. At least we do when we work together. Now, when I'm talking about the players at fault for this crisis, I'm not talking about your local responsible mom-and-pop landlord who owns maybe 5 units, maybe 50, but who manages them responsibly, who reinvests rent into their maintenance and improvement, and who, most importantly, meets their tenants face-to-face, human being to human being, to negotiate in good faith over rent and lease terms. While the dynamics there may not be exactly equal, they are orders of magnitude more balanced than the situation faced by millions of renters in this country, many of them lower moderate income, many of them representative of the communities who have been most impacted not only by this present housing crisis, but by long-standing exclusionary practices in the world of housing and wealth building. Black and indigenous folks, queer folks, single moms, immigrants, people with disabilities, veterans, working people of all stripes and backgrounds who simply want a decent home, but who are all too often forced to face large-scale corporations in which investor identities are anonymized by layers of LLCs, and in which Management is never able to be reached in the face of a maintenance emergency, but is always sure to be in touch when rent is due. But that rent is key to this whole equation. That's the investor's ROI. That's the money that pays off the mortgage that bought the property in the first place. That's the leverage that tenants, following in the footsteps of workers who organized into labor unions well over a century ago, have at our disposal. If we don't show up to work, then our bosses can't get paid. If we take control of our rents together with our neighbors and demand the basic decency of direct negotiation, then our landlords, however large, however powerful, have no choice but to come to the table. And they'll have to come to the table against us not as isolated individuals who can be intimidated and pushed out, but as a cohesive unit, as a group more powerful together than apart, as a union of collaborators standing shoulder to shoulder and demanding to be treated as an equal party to a bilateral contract, the lease. This is not easy work, but it's work that is possible. And it's work that I am seeing evidence of around the state and around the world as communities come together, embracing their interconnectedness as a strength rather than a weakness, as they work together to take control of their homes. In 2026, we'll celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the International Tenants Union, founded in Zurich to inspire these kinds of organizations worldwide. The MST movement of landless rural workers in Brazil has pioneered a model of autonomous agricultural cooperative that's motivated adjacent movements in rural and urban contexts alike. Here in the States, tenants from Connecticut have joined others from Montana, Missouri, Kentucky, and Illinois in the last couple of years to form a national tenant union federation here in the U.S. that can provide the backing and support necessary to start, sustain, and scale up these kinds of transformative organizations nationwide and to coordinate them across state lines. And here in Connecticut specifically, I have had the extraordinary privilege of watching amazing metamorphoses made possible by neighbors standing with neighbors and demanding to be the authors of their own history. I've seen brave elders make time to organize between doctor's appointments and visits with grandkids so as to ensure that their once dilapidated and neglected properties were turned into beautiful, dignified homes where they could be proud to live. I've seen over 100 tenants spend 5 months staving off displacement or homelessness after an electrical fire in their building by literally standing shoulder to shoulder together in the cold at press conferences and pickets until each and every one of them was safely and stably rehoused. I've seen tenant unions compel landlords to invest millions in much-needed maintenance and repairs. I've seen them prevent hundreds of evictions and save members tens of thousands of dollars in rent and medical bills. And this is just the beginning. Because when your housing situation isn't working, all the other elements of your life are going to get pretty chaotic. If you've been there, you know what I mean. My grandfather's right about a great many things, and he was certainly right about the fact that you're only truly in control of your own life, your own history, if you control your home. But if our traditional path to getting there through home ownership is becoming increasingly inaccessible to a broader and broader swath of our population, then we can and we must forge alternatives. Alternatives that embrace our interdependence and interconnectedness, as I said, as the strength that it is. As we come together with those who go the journey with us, who share this built environment and broader ecosystem with us, to take control of our homes and thereby our lives and advance the interests that we share with one another, because we are far more powerful united than we are apart. Picture this. You wake up one morning and you step outside to go for a walk with some of your neighbors to the community garden or greenhouse that you've planted in your complex. You bring home some berries that you toss into a blender powered by the solar panels that you and the rest of your union members had installed on your roofs. When something breaks, you know who to call and you know that it'll be fixed. When something goes wrong, you know you will have a seat at the table to set it right. You can spend more at local businesses because you're saving hundreds in rent, and you can participate in your civic life of your community because you don't have to work 3 jobs simply to make ends meet anymore. You can plan for the future with a sense of stability, knowing that you have a place to call home, even if you don't own it in a traditional sense. You can even age in place, knowing that you have a community around you to help carry the load. This is the future that tenant unions are building here in Connecticut and around the world as neighbors come together with neighbors to take housing out of the control of speculators and slumlords and to put it back in the hands of communities who can and who are cultivating conditions in which we can truly thrive and build the world that we deserve. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.